till I can't no more.
I got the horses in the back. Horse stock is attacked.
In the coming week, the coronavirus pandemic continues to reshape the world calendar. Virus concerns drive a rift between the U.S. and China, and U.S. Iranian tensions escalate again. It's March 19th, 2020, and time for The World Next Week. I'm Bob McMahon.
And I'm Jim Lindsay. As you might have detected, Bob and I are practicing social distancing. We're recording this podcast from our respective homes. And because of that, we apologize in advance for any audio issues or if any of our family members make an unanticipated appearance on the podcast.
And unsurprisingly, a major theme of this podcast and probably going forward for a bit is going to be the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. However, Jim and I are going to make an effort to remind everyone and to draw attention to what's going on in the rest of the world aside from the coronavirus pandemic. We will kick off, though, with the virus. So we've had schools, restaurants, bars, local theater, you name it, Jim. Whatever people had planned for this spring seems to have been canceled or postponed, with wishful thinking putting it for later in the spring. It also extends to the Group of Seven, which was going to have a meeting in Philadelphia in the coming week, Jim. That's now going to be held virtually. So this is a chance for some of the leading economies in the world to get together and sort out this crisis. Can you tell us, Jim, about the impact on particularly U.S. and Europe right now?
Well, I think what you're seeing, Bob, is an unprecedented shutdown on both sides of the Atlantic as governments scramble to slow the spread of COVID-19. You note that there was supposed to be a meeting next week, the 24th and 25th in Pittsburgh, of the foreign ministers of the G7. The idea is they come together and tee up everything for the G7 meeting itself, which is still scheduled to take place in June at Camp David. The United States is the host this year. But in recognition to the unprecedented circumstances we face, they're now doing their work remotely, much like we're doing this podcast remotely. And I think one of the things to sort of track coming out of that meeting is there's going to be a focus on how to coordinate the policies of the governments on dealing with the coronavirus. I think to this point, countries have been pursuing sort of individual efforts. The coordination one would hope to have has been slow in developing. It's starting to take place. I will note that the United States and Canada have agreed to close their border to non-essential travel. That agreement was reached by mutual consent. And we're seeing, I think, more of that going forward, of trying to, in essence, halt the spread of the disease.
So, Jim, as it pertains to Europe, the U.S. had already announced, now seems like a very long time ago, it wasn't, but it already announced it was cutting off travel of Europeans to the U.S., which raised some rancor. Have the two sides, let's say the EU and the U.S., developed a more productive dialogue at this point? Is it a little bit more haphazard, or what are we seeing in that terms of communication?
Well, clearly there was a great deal of unhappiness in Europe over the travel ban the Trump administration posed. That irritation, anger reflected both the fact it was sprung on them, they had no advance notice, and also, at least initially, it did not cover people coming to the United States from the United Kingdom, even though the United Kingdom has its own problem with the coronavirus, and it's also a major transit point for people coming off of the continent. I think there have been efforts since then to try to have more coordination. Again, that's, I would imagine, a big part of the challenge at this virtual G7 meeting. But I think as you look at it, the reality is the governments, even as they are being told or thinking they need to coordinate with others, are themselves just overwhelmed with all of the domestic challenges. And I think this is a situation which tests the ability of individual governments to handle a high stress crisis situation. How well do they themselves function? How prepared are they? How organized are their administrations? And again, the numbers coming out of particularly Europe are staggering. I'll note that Italy now has 36,000 confirmed cases with some 3,000 deaths. Now, the United States is about 6.5 times the population of Italy. So if you were to translate that into U.S. terms, that would be the equivalent of 20,000 deaths here in the United States. And again, these numbers are going up by the the day, and this is where I think all countries are scrambling to, and I'll borrow the term that's been used a lot in this conversation, try to flatten the curve. That is, try to find ways to slow down the transmission so that the cases of COVID-19 slow down enough that the health system can handle the most severe cases. And I think what you're seeing in Italy is that the number of cases coming through is simply swamping the ability of what is actually a pretty good healthcare system. But again, it's not designed to handle as many cases as is currently confronting. And that's the challenge all other countries are trying to meet.
And I think it's a particular severity of this virus in terms of it attacks the lungs, it attacks the respiratory system, and the requirement, especially for the people who seem to be most afflicted, the elderly, people with pre-existing conditions, is that they require respirators. So not only do you need the logistical means such as testing equipment and the ability to take people's temperature on the spot and sort of screen them that way, but also once they've been afflicted with it, to be able to provide proper care to them so that they can recover. And the Italians are talking weeks ago about a sort of a triage system, and the death toll figures are just staggering. And you're seeing the warnings from Germany, to some extent France and Spain as well, about like sort of a wartime footing or the biggest crisis they've faced since the early post-war era.
You're quite right, Bob. And I'll note that France and Spain have both invoked essentially states of emergency. France is on a lockdown over the next 2 weeks. And again, what they're trying to do is to avoid ending up on the trajectory that Italy is on. Here in the United States, you see not just the federal government, governors, mayors now mobilizing to try to encourage people to physically distance. We use the term social distance. What we really want is physical distance among people. And this is mostly designed, again, to slow down the transmission so that the healthcare system can handle the caseload. And what you're going to see looking across the country is that different states, different cities are going to be in different situations. So in a place like New York, where the virus has clearly taken hold and the governor and state and local officials are scrambling to try to get people to separate, is in a different position than other states and localities where the number of cases is smaller. So in a sense, if you start these policies of physical distancing, closing down schools, closing down restaurants, asking people to work from home, it's much more effective when the number of cases in a community is small than when it's already gotten very large. And again, what will then happen is you could have a state, let's say New York, in a situation where its healthcare infrastructure is really being stressed by the number of cases, but in other parts of the country not seeing similar caseloads. And then you get into question about how do you share resources? How do you get resources, things like masks, medicines, respirators, ventilators to the hardest hit places? And then that's going to really require some tough decision making and a lot of coordination. Just one last thing. I don't want to lose sight of this because you've been talking about Europe and the United States. I mean, this virus is global and it is taking a major toll in countries around the world. I mean, if you look at a place like Iran, which officially has about 19,000 cases with some 1,300 dead, again, official numbers, the true numbers are likely far higher. And I think you're going to see significant spread of this disease in the Middle East, in Africa, countries that don't have healthcare systems capable of meeting this challenge. And one can only wonder what will happen if the virus makes its way to a place like Syria, refugee camps, Yemen, refugee camps, what kind of outcome we're going to be facing.
No, it's truly staggering. I mean, if you think about the response to the Ebola virus, which far more lethal, but also spread in a much different way and was able to be contained ultimately, I'm talking about the outbreak of 5 years ago in West Africa. But you had, the U.S. leading a global effort to sort of set up these kind of tent cities in a way to isolate those with the disease, to get healthcare workers on the scene. And they did snuff it out eventually, and they did contain it. But this is a different beast. I think it lulled people a little bit because the lethality was of a different sort, but nobody's lulled anymore, I don't think, Jim. So we'll have to see.
But that, of course, Bob, has raised complaints that people are overreacting, that governments are doing too much, and that this is creating collateral damage, particularly in the economy when, restaurants shut down, bars shut down, office buildings shut down. This directly affects a lot of people's lives. They lose their livelihood. And so I know there have been people saying, are we acting too fast? Are we overreacting? And, I think Anthony Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, has really been the point person on this, framed it quite right. He'd rather be in a situation in which you overreact than you underreact, because the human toll if we underreact, is going to be quite significant. So in many ways, what we're trying to do is to create a self-denying prophecy to get people to change their behavior so much that the terrible outcome we're worried about doesn't actually manifest.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the quote-unquote overreacting aspect and move over to China, the origin, as we understand it, of this in Wuhan. I believe today they marked the first day that there had not been a new case reported there. There's obviously been a great slowing of the virus in China. China has been touting itself as a country that can come to the assistance of other countries by ramping up production of badly needed medical supplies. But it's also looks to be in the midst of a pretty nasty spat with the United States. These are the two largest economies in the world over some tit-for-tat response to the presence of journalists in their country. The U.S. president continues to refer to this as the Chinese virus, which has provoked a very strong reaction from China as well. So, Jim, could you talk a little bit about what's happening here on the U.S.-China front? Is this just surface rhetoric? Are there other more hopeful things happening?
I think this right now is mostly rhetorical barbs, tit for tat, going back and forth. I will note that, President Trump's use of the term the China virus, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo prefers to call it the Wuhan virus. To some extent, that reflects the president's nationalistic, us against them worldview. You can make arguments that there's a political advantage to sort of focusing on this as something that came from outside. Again, maybe it moves the president's base. But I think there's also a policy aspect to this here, which is that the administration is trying to counter what is clearly a Chinese effort to recast its responsibility and role in the spread of the coronavirus. And I'll note number one, you mentioned that China has reported no new cases. I'm not sure how seriously I would take that number, given the clear incentives the Chinese have to downplay the virus and also play up how well they have handled or responded to the coronavirus crisis. But, what's interesting is that the Chinese have clearly launched a disinformation propaganda campaign on this issue. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson has been particularly vocal. It's interesting. He has a Twitter feed. Now, of course, if you live in China, you're not allowed to have a Twitter feed. But last week he tweeted out, quote, "It might be the U.S. Army who brought the epidemic to Wuhan. U.S. owe us an explanation." He then tweeted out a report from a Canadian organization that traffics in conspiracy theories, that the virus originated in the United States. Clearly, the Chinese have been also talking about how successful their response has been and how they sort of seized the initiative and to use the term that the Chinese commentators like to use, bought time for the rest of the world. There's an awful lot of evidence that the Chinese reacted quite slowly and unevenly to the outbreak of the crisis. And
actually suppressed reporting and people trying to step up and raise awareness about it.
Very much so. And I note that early in the crisis, a Chinese research institute, I think it was in Shanghai, released the genome because it had sequenced it. And this was very helpful to other researchers around the world to let them mobilize to figure out how to deal with the virus. But my understanding is those researchers were subsequently admonished for having done so. So I think what you have going back and forth here is, again, a bit of tit for tat as each country tries to make its case. You mentioned the fact that the Chinese recently suspended, kicked out of the country, I guess, reporters from like the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, in New York Times. I think I have that correct.
That's right.
That followed up on the United States earlier in the month implementing new restrictions on Chinese journalists working in the United States, placing a cap on 5 Chinese state-controlled media entities. This gets us, again, back to this bigger question of, how to deal with China, which is clearly trying to tell its story to the world and often doing so in ways that wouldn't sort of fit with our definition of fair, open, balanced news. And so this is going to be an issue that is going to continue. It's a big issue in the United States. It's been a big issue in places like Australia and New Zealand. For those of you who are interested and want to follow this, our colleague Josh Kalansik is doing a big project on Chinese sort of soft information techniques. You can find some of his writings on the CFR blog, Asia Unbound. But this is a bigger issue about how information is shaped and distributed and used to shape a global narrative.
Yeah, I think as this crisis plays out, there'll be an ongoing and emerging sort of plot line involving the U.S.-China competition morphing in new directions as it appears.
Well, Bob, we'll continue to pay attention to the dialogue that goes between Washington and Beijing to see if it moves beyond rhetoric to actual changes in policy. But now let's sort of shift gears and talk about other things happening around the world outside of the coronavirus. And I really want to focus on the news coming out of the Middle East. Just yesterday, the United States imposed new sanctions on Iran in response to 2 rocket strikes on U.S. forces based in Baghdad. This story is still unfolding, but can you just give us a sense of where we think this might be going?
Sure, Jim. And it's inescapable to also, mention some coronavirus overtones as part of all this. But yes, amidst all of the crisis, and as you alluded to earlier, Iran facing a particularly severe dose of the virus, a group with Iranian affiliations known as Hezbollah Kata'ib is believed to have launched attacks on U.S. positions in Iraq. You mentioned 2 rounds. First one killed 2 American soldiers and a British one as well. And there was another follow-up round. I have not seen any reports of casualties from that one. The first one prompted a U.S. counterattack on these 5 Hezbollah Kata'ib positions. And then came the announcement just a couple days ago of yet more sanctions against Iranian, both petrochemical companies, I believe, and individuals. This is also coming at a time when the U.S. is facing growing pressure to ease up on sanctions that, because of what's known as secondary sanctions that are part of the whole sanctions matrix, are affecting the Iranians' ability to get medical supplies and medicines. The UK, among other countries, has been calling on the U.S. to ease up on that front. The U.S. has responded previously saying the problem is that you cannot trust the Iranians to send any easing up of revenues for Iran to purchase such stuffs can be diverted in just the malign ways we've seen in terms of attacks or supporting proxies who would attack U.S. forces, among others. So maybe it should have been expected, but it seems to be unexpected. Another aspect of the U.S.-Iranian tensions playing out in the Middle East, Jim. Iran is also, this coming days, approaching one of its big festival days of the year, which is Nowruz.
That's the Iranian New Year?
That's the Iranian New Year. It's a really big occasion, and they have essentially canceled a lot of the big Nowruz events. And in fact, the closing down of some Shiite shrines have brought about a great deal of backlash in a couple of venues in Iran from worshipers, because these shrines are usually open 24/7. But they also...
my sense is they have been a source of spreading the infection because people in tight spaces together passing along the infection.
Exactly, Jim. And we've seen throughout the world where you've had religious gatherings, they have ended up in a few places in particular have become nodes for spreading concentrated amounts of the virus. So Iranians, like other authorities and religious authorities and otherwise, have canceled or closed down places of worship, events of worship. And again, it's a time period where there's lots of these everywhere, but especially in Iran. So Nowruz will be a somber affair. At the same time, as it's also become a bit of a Nowruz tradition, Iran is releasing prisoners, and they are actually setting them free for good. They've announced a number of them are political prisoners. So Iran released 85,000 political prisoners. There's a group of them that are political prisoners that Iran's saying that they are free. They're still facing U.S. pressure to make sure that U.S.-affiliated prisoners are released as well. It's not clear whether this announcement of releasing them and freeing them is in any way due to U.S. pressure or pressure from other parts, because there's other countries that also are pressing Iran on this. But it's just another sign of possible impact at a time when Iran's being watched very closely, especially because of what's happened both in Iraq with these proxy attacks, but also the level, as you indicated before, Jim, of the growth of the virus there. Again, official accounts show roughly 1,300 deaths. There are some outside experts who say it could be 5 times as much as that. And among other things, people have raised alarm. Iran has a high number of people still afflicted with lung illnesses dating back to the Iran-Iraq War. The Iraqis under Saddam Hussein used gas in some of their attacks. And so an estimated 100,000 Iranians, veterans from that conflict, could be at risk with the coronavirus, which again is particularly severe on people with respiratory problems. It all goes to say, Jim, that there is a great deal of concern building up in Iran right now, both domestically and regarding its international activities. And it's leaving a lot of people to wonder, just how far this can go in terms of the outbreak within the country, its actions abroad. On top of everything else, Jim, the main cash source for the Iranians, which is oil. Oil prices are flooring out right now, in part instigated by a Saudi-Russian dispute. So it's an extremely difficult time for the Iranians. It does raise questions on what they are after in Iraq at the moment.
Bob, are we seeing any signs of unrest politically within Iran? people calling their leaders to account? Or does it still seem to be the case that the hardliners were able to suppress dissent?
They are moving in some ways similar to what China has done. They are moving to suppress dissent. They are saying they're trying to suppress disinformation, but they are certainly spreading some of their own as well. But from all accounts, and Iran happens to be one of these places where information does get out despite the authoritarian nature of the regime. And we have not seen anything like the revolts that we have seen just in recent months, whether it was in response to the Iranian shooting down of a passenger plane after the U.S. killing of Hassan Soleimani, or other protests last fall in response to some domestic moves that affected the economy. There's been round after round of domestic disputes. What we have seen with these prisoner releases are people who a number of them had been arrested because they were outspoken in these protests of recent vintage. They are being released. That is seen as maybe a bit of a release valve for some protests. It remains to be seen, Jim. It could very well grow up again, but at the moment, it's a little bit muted.
And what do you make of the fact the U.S. administration has started to reduce troops in the Middle East, troops that were surged to the region earlier in the year over concerns about Iranian aggression?
That's another one of the head scratchers from this week, Jim. The responses I've seen from U.S. officials is that these were part of an already planned rotation, whether you talk about some troop movements from Iraq or otherwise. It's no secret that overall, President Trump would like to reduce the U.S. footprint in the Middle East and elsewhere. But at this particular time, when they were making a great point of a show of force against Iran, the presence of U.S. forces were supposed to be a sort of a manifest, signal that the U.S. is here to counter any Iranian influence. I think there was a feeling, though, Jim, that before the most recent downturn in both the spread of the virus and the Iranian activities in Iraq, there was a feeling that the Iranians were not going to be staging any other sort of proxy attacks for a while, that there was a feeling that they had made their gestures after the death of Qasem Soleimani and that they were sort of standing down for the moment. But I think that's been dispelled a bit. It will be interesting to see now whether these drawdowns continue in any sort of sequence, whether they are stopped for a while, because when U.S. service members are killed in the field, it usually causes the opposite effect. Usually, not always.
Certainly does.
Well, Jim, we've segued now into our figure of the week portion of the podcast. Who or what is your figure?
Bob, my figure of the week is a number, and it's $20.37. That's the price that West Texas Intermediate crude hit in trading yesterday. It was down 24% in a single day. That's the lowest price for West Texas crude since February 2002. To put that $20 figure in perspective, West Texas crude was priced around $60 at the end of 2019. Now, West Texas Intermediate crude is one of the two major benchmarks of oil prices. The other one is the so-called Brent crude price, and that's based on oil produced in the North Sea. Should note that Brent crude has also plunged so far in 2020. It stands now a shade under $25, the lowest it's been since May of 2003. Big question is, why the price crash? The answer lies in three simple words known to anyone who has taken Economics 101, supply and demand. Let's take the demand side first because it's the more obvious. With COVID-19 shutting down big parts of the global economy, less demand for oil, planes aren't flying, cars and trucks are sitting idle in parking lots. That really depresses demand. The supply change is perhaps less obvious, but you pointed to it a moment ago in talking about Iran, Bob, and that is a price war that began 11 days ago between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Here, a little bit of background is needed. You might remember that back in 2014, oil prices exceeded $100 a barrel. That's when the U.S. shale revolution began to hit, putting more oil on the market. Oil prices fell by 2016. They were in the upper 20s. Faced with falling revenues, OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, cut a deal with Russia, which is not an OPEC member, to cut production of oil. That deal held for several years. Oil prices rose, again, I mentioned a moment ago, hitting around $60 at the end of 2019. Flash forward to the start of the month, Saudi Arabia calls for cuts in production because it sees that demand is falling, but this time Russia says no. And here's what the really interesting part. Rather than let Russia profit at its expense, Riyadh did an about face and said, okay, we're going to up our production. The calculation appears to be that Saudi Arabia can tolerate a low price environment better and longer than the Russians can, thereby forcing Moscow to cry uncle. There may also be a side calculation in Saudi Arabia that low oil prices will also take the sales out of U.S. oil producers. Keep in mind, the United States now produces more oil on a daily basis than Saudi Arabia does. All of this is bad news for the U.S. oil industry and all the other industries that sell to it, and it's going to add to the intense headwinds the U.S. economy faces from the coronavirus.
It's a great figure, Jim. It also, there's so many offshoots to this. I mean, the other one that's starting to gain some attention would be worth watching is, so you have less fossil fuels being consumed and burned, therefore you have less emissions and greenhouse gases being produced. And there are some stunning images that are being produced from former industrial sites and so forth that are appearing in some media showing the reduction in emissions. Some people have said in the past, it will take some truly shocking event to change the trajectory of fossil fuel consumption. Well, we may be in the middle of one right now. And so that's going to be worth watching as this coronavirus plays out and as this slowdown, which is really gathering steam, picks up.
You're quite right, Bob. And the New York Times in particular has had some really stunning graphics looking at this. And here's the big question, which is how long is this global slowdown going to last? Is it a case that 45 days from now, things return to normal, or are we looking at a new normal in which we may go months, perhaps even longer than a year, with this sort of clamp down on production, with this physical distancing? Obviously, the longer it goes, the more extensive the ramifications in terms of how people live their lives and adapt. But Bob, over to you. Who or what is your figure of the week?
Jim, my figure is a person. It is Ruslan Ryaboshabka. I hope I got that pronunciation right. He is the former prosecutor general of Ukraine, who was sacked earlier this month, in a sign that a number of Ukraine observers and good governance observers say shows sort of a dark direction the country is moving in. He was replaced just this week by Irina Venediktova, who's a former advisor to President Zelensky in Ukraine and a lawmaker from his party. But Ryaboshabka was known for acting in a sort of a sweeping fashion against corrupt practices, against a whole set of sectors in the country in sort of a breathtaking fashion. Ukraine is infamous for deep-seated corruption. He was not sparing seemingly any sector, but the reason for his dismissal was that he was inadequate to the task. It's worth also noting that he, among other things, he did take a look at the role of Hunter Biden, the son of the U.S. Vice President and current presidential candidate Joe Biden, with the Ukrainian firm Burisma, and found no wrongdoing there. So it remains to be seen, Jim, what direction Ukraine is going in, whether this is some sort of infighting going on in the country of a limited nature, whether there's something more of a sea change taking effect with the still new president Zelensky shifting from his reformist rhetoric into a more realpolitik fashion that is a little bit more familiar to Ukrainian watchers.
I'm just curious, Bob, and you may not know the answer. Do we have any sense of how the coronavirus is impacting events in Ukraine?
Ukraine, like other countries in the region, has registered a number of cases. It has not in any way taken off at this stage as it has in Western Europe, but it hasn't had as many testing events and testing opportunities, I think, as we're seeing in the rest of Europe. And I think I also just happened to see something where China had delivered a number of testing kits and other materials to Ukraine to be able to sort of cope with virus testing, containment measures, and so forth. But it's not facing what a number of Western European countries are facing.
Because I would imagine President Zelensky has his hands full with lots of other challenges, domestic economics, obviously the secession movement supported by the Russians in the East, corruption and the like.
Yeah, Ukraine really at any time in the last several years, you take your pick, it's got multiple crises at a time, but especially now there is this massive, public health crisis on top of the country's already severe problems. It's severe economic challenges. It's going to ask for IMF help very soon if it hasn't asked already. It's just marked 6 years since Russia annexed Crimea with no sign that Crimea is coming back under Ukrainian sovereignty anytime soon. It is trying to pursue a painstaking peace process with its secessionist regions in its east, and it's trying to navigate its way with its relationship with the U.S. administration that has called on it to investigate more intensely the doings of Joe Biden's son, Hunter.
I'll note you mentioned the Chinese sending test kits to Ukraine. This is really sort of the positive side of the Chinese effort to reshape the narrative around coronavirus. Chinese government has been very active in trying to provide help and advice to countries around the world. So That's the upside of the Chinese effort to shape the narrative.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Jim, there's no doubt there's soft power dividends here. Soft power does mean providing things that other countries need, and in so doing, hoping to gain some set of influence. We'll see if that latter happens, but certainly China has been in many directions trying to share its sort of ramped up capacity for dealing with the virus.
And obviously, soft power used to be something the United States was really good at.
It did indeed. And that's our look at the world next week. Here's some other stories to keep an eye on. Plans are still on for the Japanese Olympic torch relay to kick off in Fukushima, and Pakistan celebrates Republic Day.
Please subscribe to The World Next Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a review while you're at it. They help us get noticed and improve the show. Please note that opinions expressed in The World Next Week are solely those of the host or our guests, not a CFR, which takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. Today's program was produced by Zoe Collis with senior producer Jeremy Shirley. Special thanks go out to Anu Kumar, Claire McGraw, and Anna Shortridge for their assistance. This week, our recording engineer was Zoe Collis. Thank you again for pulling double duty, Zoe. Our theme music is provided by Miguel Herrero and licensed under Creative Commons. This is Jim Lindsay saying goodbye.
And this is Bob McMahon saying so long and be safe out there.